It's been 31 years since the 51-day siege by the ATF and the FBI of a compound in Waco, Texas. The siege would leave David Koresh, 33, the leader of the Branch Davidian cult, dead, along with many of his followers and 4 ATF agents. David Koresh started out life as Vernon Wayne Howell. He had a fairly dysfunctional childhood that he described as lonely. As a young adult, he did not demonstrate appropriate boundaries with young girls at all. At 19, he got a 15-year-old girl pregnant. He would join his mother's Seventh-day Adventist church, where he became obsessed with the pastor's daughter, a girl of only 12. He alleged that God sent him a sign that the young girl was to be his wife. The pastor made Koresh leave, but when Koresh persisted in his pursuit of the preteen, until the pastor expelled him from the congregation. There existed in 1955 a group called the Davidians Seventh-day Adventist Church. In that year, Benjamin Roden splintered a group called the Branch Davidians from the original. He had new teachings that didn't agree with the original church. In any way, they were based in Waco. Benjamin would die in 1978, leaving his wife Lois as the leader of the sect. In 1981, Koresh, then 22, moved to Waco to join them. Just 2 years later, he would begin claiming that he was given the gift of prophecy. He may or may not have been having an intimate relationship with Lois, who was approaching 70 years old then. He would say that God chose him to father a child by Lois. The child would be the chosen one. At around the same time, Lois began allowing Koresh to teach his own messages to the sect. He called his message the serpent's root. The move did not sit well within the sect. Lois and Benjamin had a son, this man, George Roden. He was to become the group's next leader and did not appreciate any competition from Koresh, with, his talk of prophetic power. Koresh said that he was told by God to marry Rachel Jones, and things calmed down for a very short time. But things would soon heat up again, turning south quicker than sparrows at the beginning of winter. But this time, the compound at Waco had become known as the Mount Carmel Center. It contained a number of valuable buildings, including a $500,000 administration building. Well, one day that burned down. Roden would say Koresh started the fire. Koresh would claim it was the judgment of God. Well, this whole situation was not going to be resolved with a handshake. Roden would claim leadership of the sect and force Koresh and his followers off the property at gunpoint. About 25 people left with Koresh, and they set up what can only be described as a post-apocalyptic campsite, about 90 miles from Waco at Palestine, Texas. Conditions there were very rough. They cooked out, living in buses and tents for the next 2 years. Despite that, Koresh managed to recruit new followers to his cause, people from California, the UK, Israel, and as far off as Australia. While this group was exiled, Lois died in 1986. He traveled to Israel while still living in that camp. There he claimed that he was given a vision that he was Cyrus. Cyrus refers to Cyrus II of Persia, who was a biblical emperor who founded the Persian Empire. When the Jews were held captive in Babylon, it is said that Cyrus was their liberator. So yeah, lofty heights to claim there. Koresh at one time planned to set up his Davidic kingdom in Jerusalem. He believed he would be martyred there in Israel. Then something changed for him, and he became convinced that he was to be martyred in the U.S. instead. He began to believe that Mount Carmel was the Davidic kingdom, and that the prophecies of Daniel would happen at Waco. More and more, he was gaining the support and loyalty of the Branch Davidian sect. 1987 came along, and Koresh accused Roden of illegally exhuming one or more corpses from the cemetery at Mount Carmel. He wanted Roden arrested, but authorities demanded evidence, aside from Koresh's assertions. So, in a scene from the Wild Wild West, Koresh shows up at Mount Carmel with a number of armed followers to try and get photographs of exhumed corpses. Roden finds the group and a gunfight breaks out. Sheriffs show up. Roden has a minor gunshot wound and he was hiding behind a tree. Sheriffs arrest Koresh and his 7 cronies for attempted murder, but they were acquitted of the charges. Things most definitely were not getting better between the two would-be spiritual leaders. Back at Mount Carmel, Wayman Dale Adair began telling people that he was the true Messiah. Well, Roden already had enough of that with Koresh, so he murdered Adair with an axe to the head. Roden was sent off to a psychiatric hospital, having been adjudged insane. He left Mount Carmel with a tax bill in the thousands, and so authorities were going to seize it. Koresh and his sect raised the money and claimed back the property. Apparently, when they moved in, tenants who had been renting from Roden had built a meth lab there. So Koresh contacted police and had it removed. Finally, Koresh and the Branch Davidians could live in peace and get on with cult business. Right? No, that is not how the story goes. Koresh began marrying women and girls in the sect, whether they were already married or not. He would claim that he was to have 24 children by the women he chose from the sect, and those children would grow to become the ruling elders for the 1,000 years after the return of Christ. One of these wives was an underage girl named Michelle Jones, the little sister of his only legal wife. Allegations began flowing out of the compound that Koresh was sexually and physically abusing children. Well, no wonder. CPS shows up in 1992, but they found no evidence of sexual abuse. The Branch Davidians had hid it all. The so-called marriage between Koresh and Michelle Jones, for example. They also found no evidence of physical abuse. However, former members would say that Koresh beat his son Cyrus severely, and visitors to the compound would say they saw Koresh beat a young boy with a stick. We'll get back to the abuse allegations later. Though the CPS investigations that lasted for 6 months in 1992 came up empty, it will all be very important. The ATF received tips that Koresh and the Branch Davidians were stockpiling illegal weapons, like hand grenades, at Mount Carmel. They obtained a search warrant for the compound, along with arrest warrants for Koresh and several of the cult members. Because of the danger of a big stockpile of weapons, ATF planned a daylight raid of the compound in order to serve and effect the warrants. The daylight raid might have been effective and done in a way where no one was hurt. However, a KWTX-TV reporter had been tipped off about the raid. He asked a USPS mail carrier for directions to the compound. The mail carrier was Koresh's brother-in-law. So news of the raid then reached the compound, and the sect was fully armed and ready for ATF agents to show up. An undercover agent inside the compound, Robert Rodriguez, was told by Koresh, "Hey, your cover's blown. We know a raid's coming." And a gunfight erupted. 4 ATF agents, Steve Willis, Robert Williams, Todd McKeon, and Conway Charles LeBleu, and 6 Branch Davidians, Winston Blake, Peter Gint, Peter Hipsman, Perry Jones, Jaden Wendell, and Michael Schroeder, all died in that conflict on the very first day. The ATF and the FBI, with support from the National Guard and other state organizations, like the Texas Rangers, then laid siege to the compound. It was February 28, 1993. It's important to understand some of the beliefs of the cult in order to understand what happened during and at the end of the siege. First, They had apocalyptic beliefs, believing that Koresh would become a martyr and that the siege and subsequent violence was a sign that they were in the end times. That is essential to understand why so many stayed at Mount Carmel for so long during that siege. You should also understand that there was no unified agreement among the FBI as the lead organization of the siege as to how to approach an ending to the standoff. The FBI had dealt with standoffs before Waco, but nothing on the same level, and certainly nothing that dealt with such a large group of armed religious cult members who also had a large group of children with them. On day one, which was February 28th, the ATF withdrew and the FBI takes command. They have jurisdiction whenever any federal agent from any department is killed. There were two men in charge, which is something that became problematic. First was the head of the San Antonio field office, Jeff Jamar, and the other was the head of the FBI's hostage rescue team, Richard Rogers. Richard Rogers had also been at Ruby Ridge, which we'll talk about in a different video. He would override the site commander, Jamar, whenever he wanted to, essentially. This left a tangle at the top of the chain of command that would cause some issues. For the first few hours, the cult members had telephone access to local news media, and Koresh gave interviews from inside the compound. But the FBI cut off telephone communications from the compound to the outside world. For the remainder of the siege, the Branch Davidians could only contact one of 25 different FBI negotiators by phone. These negotiators had quite a job on their hands, not only from those in the cult, but also from others within the FBI, including tactical commanders, who often just undercut their work. One of the first things they were able to negotiate was an agreement with Koresh that the group would come out peacefully if a recorded message made by Koresh was broadcast on national radio. So that message was broadcast, but Koresh did not come out, and neither did the majority of the cult members. Koresh would say that God told him to stay inside and wait. The negotiators did manage, however, to facilitate the release of 19 children who were between 5 months old to 12 years old without their parents. That left 98 people in the compound. Many of the children were interviewed by Texas Rangers and the FBI. Several of the children would report that they had been physically and sexually abused long before the ATF showed up at the compound. These interviews would, like the CPS investigation, play a real role in how this siege ended, and we will get back to it. FBI agents sent in a video camera. Koresh introduced his children and his wives on the video, including several underage females who said they had Koresh's children. They taped the other members as well, including 23 other children, to show that each of them had remained in Mount Carmel voluntarily. By now it's the 9th day of the siege, and the FBI viewed the videotape. Koresh, meanwhile, negotiated for more time. He wanted to write religious documents, and then he would surrender, he said. Outside, the FBI were treating the situation as a hostage crisis. Though, with the exception of children staying with their parents, there was no evidence at that point that anyone was being held within the compound by force. The same week, the FBI worked with a pair of biblical scholars to try to understand Koresh's beliefs. A little more than 3 weeks later, the scholars would go on the radio to talk about the siege. One of the scholars used biblical references to the Apostle Paul to try to encourage Koresh to surrender peacefully, knowing that Koresh could listen to this radio broadcast. The longer the siege went on, and the more Koresh resisted a peaceful surrender, the more the FBI began to split on how to manage the situation and bring it to an end. One side wanted to continue negotiations, and the other wanted to force the cult members out. On the tactical side, FBI actions became far more aggressive. And if you're old enough, you will remember nearly every evening on the news, you heard what the cult members heard. Loudspeakers sent all manner of noise into the compound all night long. There was the sound of jet planes, pop music played repeatedly, Christmas carols, Gregorian chanting, and the sound of rabbits being slaughtered. Rabbits scream. Viewers got a few seconds of it, but the cult members heard that type of thing all night long. One of the songs that were played, "These Boots Are Made for Walking," was played over and over and over again. If the music wasn't enough and the noise wasn't enough, more than a dozen military vehicles patrolled around and around the compound. Branch Davidians had buried those who died on the first day of the siege, and the vehicles would drive over the graves repeatedly. FBI negotiators asked them to stop, and the Branch Davidians protested, but that grave, particularly the one of Peter Gent, was driven over anyway. The noise, the patrolling vehicles, they just weren't very effective. So the FBI cut all power and water to the compound. Inside, they collected rainwater and ate MREs. This may have been more effective given that Koresh ordered 11 of his followers to leave the compound once that happened. They left and were detained as material witnesses. One of them was arrested for conspiracy to murder. Koresh began to behave more erratically. He was referring to himself as the second coming of Christ and refusing to leave because he said God told him to stay. He refused to speak to the FBI at all for about 8 days, saying that he was observing Passover. Despite no evidence, the FBI started worrying about a mass suicide. And some of the FBI began talking about using snipers to locate and kill Koresh and some of the other prominent cult members. By April 14th, Koresh wrote that he was writing out the 7th seal of the 7 seals, and when he was done, he would come out. Psychologists would tell the FBI that there was not likely to be an early end to the siege given Koresh's attitudes, his beliefs, and his statements. The ATF and the FBI, neither of them, has jurisdiction over child abuse investigations. Let's make that clear. Yet, they used the several allegations against Koresh, along with the deteriorating conditions in the compound, no power or water, to justify an assault of the compound to the then U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno. Reno took their case to President Clinton. Clinton recommended the FBI use tactics that were used in his home state a few years before with the CSA siege, which saw no loss of life at all. But Reno would rely on suggestions of ongoing child sexual abuse and the idea that there might be a mass suicide, along with the cost of the siege, and the fact that the tactical teams were just getting sick and tired of waiting, to justify the assault. Reno would change her justification later, suggesting that a militia was on its way to Waco to either attack Koresh or help him out. Her justifications just changed too often to make sense. All due respect to Janet Reno. In the morning of April 19, 1993, the assault began. Loudspeakers told the cult members that there wasn't going to be an armed assault, only vehicles that would be used to pump CS gas into the buildings. The FBI would claim that there were no shots fired on their side, but there were shots fired by the Branch Davidians. They would say their response to those shots was only to pump more gas into the buildings. As they ran out of CS rounds, and they did, they obtained more from the Texas Rangers, along with flashbang grenades and illumination flares. 6 hours into that siege, and the pumping of the CS gas, not a single person in the compound came out. Many hid in a concrete room called the bunker, or otherwise they used gas masks. There is disagreement as to who is responsible for what happened next, but 3 fires began nearly simultaneously around noon in different parts of the compound. 9 people left the compound during the fire. Every other person in the compound would die by suffocation, gunshot wound, or burial under rubble. The FBI would say that this man, Steve Schneider, killed Koresh before killing himself. At the end of the day, the buildings would be razed and 76 people would be dead, most of them in the bunker. An independent investigation would find that the cult members had enough time to escape the fires if they had wanted to. 20 of the Branch Davidians, including Schneider, Koresh, and 5 children under 14, had been shot. A toddler, Dalen Gent, just 3, had been stabbed. Most experts would agree that most of these were mercy killings once any chance of escaping the fire had passed. After the tragic mess at Waco, both the ATF and the FBI changed their methods, their training, and their policies. 12 surviving cult members were indicted for a variety of charges, including the murder of the ATF agents and firearms charges. Federal prosecutors would drop charges against 1 person before trial, leaving 11 facing trial. The jury would acquit 4 more of the Branch Davidians altogether. That left 7. All of them would be acquitted of murder, but they were convicted of a variety of other charges, including voluntary manslaughter of the agents and weapons charges, and 1 for resisting arrest. They received sentences of up to 40 years, which were adjusted on appeal, and by 2007, all had served their time and been released. Several surviving cult members and family of those that didn't survive sued the federal government and some of the state agencies for what happened. Those claims that survived until trial were dismissed as the judge determined that the ATF agents only returned gunfire on the first day of the siege to protect themselves and other agents. He also found that the use of tear gas was not negligent and that the Branch Davidians themselves started the fires. The dismissal was upheld on appeal. Today, on the site that was destroyed 31 years ago, Charles Pace, leader of a new branch of the Davidians, lives on the property with his wife and 2 children. He has said that God has chosen him to rebuild a purified church and community. Thank you for listening. If you're enjoying these videos and want more, don't forget to subscribe and turn on your notifications so that you don't miss any videos. Thank you for watching. We really appreciate it.